When we think of the wizarding world, our minds often conjure images of Hogwarts' hallowed halls, Diagon Alley's bustling streets, or perhaps the epic battle between good and evil that shaped modern wizarding society. But what if we turned our attention further back? Long before wands were fashioned and the statute of secrecy was enforced, magic coursed through the veins of the world, wild, untamed, and deeply interwoven with the fabric of ancient civilizations. The ancient wizarding world was a place of mysticism and power, a time when the boundary between Muggle and magical was blurred, and magic wasn't just a tool or a skill, it was life itself. Let us venture together into this forgotten era. Imagine a time when wizarding communities didn't hide in the shadows but instead stood as revered, or feared, pillars of their societies. Magic was both a blessing and a danger, capable of forging alliances and tearing civilizations apart. While history books at Hogwarts skim over these earlier centuries, preferring to focus on events like the Goblin Rebellions or the founding of Hogwarts, there is a wealth of untold stories hidden in the cracks of ancient history. These tales are not just about magic, they are about how it shaped the world as we know it. To understand them is to understand the origins of wizarding culture itself. In the earliest days, magic was as raw and unpredictable as the elements. Witches and wizards of ancient history didn't wield neatly crafted wands. Instead, they channeled their power directly through their hands, voices, or even through enchanted objects they created. Early magical societies flourished alongside non-magical ones, leaving their mark in ways that often went unrecognized. Take, for instance, the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Though Muggles attribute their construction to incredible feats of engineering, many wizarding historians believe magical intervention was at play. Could it be that ancient Egyptian sorcerers worked alongside Muggle laborers, using levitation charms to lift massive stones and protective enchantments to safeguard the pharaoh's treasures? This harmony between magical and non-magical people did not always last, however. The gradual separation of the wizarding and Muggle worlds began to take root even in ancient times. Magic, while wondrous, was also feared. When natural disasters struck or plague swept through cities, many non-magical communities pointed accusing fingers at their magical neighbors. This fear, often fed by misunderstandings and superstition, led to early instances of persecution. But it also forged resilience among magical communities, compelling them to form hidden networks, develop more sophisticated magical practices, and pass down their knowledge in secret. Even in this era of uncertainty, however, there were moments of brilliance. Ancient Greece, for instance, was a cradle for both magical and Muggle innovation. It is said that some of the most famous philosophers of the time, people like Pythagoras and Plato, had ties to magical knowledge, their intellectual musings influenced by secret collaborations with wizarding scholars. In fact, the ancient Greeks were among the first to develop rudimentary versions of spells, codified in texts that would later evolve into spellbooks. The magical traditions of potion making and enchanting began to emerge during this time, often blending with Muggle alchemy and early scientific exploration. This fusion gave rise to some of the magical principles that still form the foundation of wizarding education today. What's more, magical creatures played an integral role in ancient wizarding history. Dragons soared above Nordic fjords, revered as living embodiments of the elements. Phoenixes were seen as omens of renewal and immortality in Asian cultures. And acromantulas, though fearsome, were believed to be protectors of sacred temples in the dense jungles of South America. Wizards of the time held an almost spiritual reverence for these creatures, forging bonds that were both practical and symbolic. These ancient relationships remind us that the history of magic is not merely a human story. It is one of connection to the natural and magical worlds alike. As we step further into this exploration of the ancient wizarding world, we'll delve into specific magical societies, their innovations and their struggles. What led to the eventual split between magical and non-magical communities? How did early wizards and witches pass down their knowledge before the advent of formalized education? And perhaps most intriguingly, what can these ancient practices teach us about the magic we know today? As we continue to peel back the layers of ancient wizarding history, it becomes clear that early magical societies were as diverse and multifaceted as the lands they inhabited. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the frozen tundras of Siberia, magic adapted to its surroundings, intertwining with local cultures and influencing the very structure of these ancient civilizations. Unlike the concealed wizarding communities of today, Early witches and wizards often lived in the open, revered as leaders, shamans, healers, or even warriors. To better understand the wizarding world of ancient times, let us take a closer look at how these societies flourished and what legacies they left behind. In Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, magic was as fundamental to daily life as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Wizarding historians believe that the earliest magical societies were small, close-knit clans that passed down their knowledge orally. These early wizards and witches were not just spellcasters. They were also skilled in runic magic. They inscribed intricate protective glyphs on clay tablets and temples, using these runes to invoke blessings or ward off malevolent forces. Interestingly, these early magical glyphs are believed to have influenced the development of ancient Mughal writing systems like cuneiform. The relationship between magical and non-magical people in Mesopotamia was surprisingly harmonious. Magic was seen as a gift from the gods, and witches and wizards were often regarded as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. Temples in cities like Babylon may have housed not only priests, but also magical scholars who worked to align celestial movements with magical rituals. These rituals weren't limited to divination or healing. They were also used in agricultural magic to ensure bountiful harvests. This symbiotic relationship between magic and Mughal innovation is a reminder of how deeply intertwined the two worlds once were. Turning our attention to ancient Egypt, we find one of the most sophisticated magical societies of the ancient world. Egyptian magic was rooted in the concept of Heka, a force that was believed to permeate all aspects of existence. Wizards and witches in Egypt were masters of enchantments, using amulets, spells, and charms to protect individuals in both life and death. Some of the most famous Egyptian wizards, such as Amset and Shepset, are thought to have played key roles in crafting the protective spells that guard the tombs of the pharaohs to this day. In fact, Egyptian magical traditions were so advanced that they were among the first to formalize magical education. Evidence suggests the existence of magical academies hidden within the grand temples of Heliopolis and Thebes. These schools emphasized potion making, spellcraft, and even early forms of transfiguration. Interestingly, the Egyptian preference for hieroglyphics as a medium for spell creation inspired later magical languages, including the magical runes studied at Hogwarts. But while Egyptian magic often focused on order and preservation, the magical traditions of ancient Greece leaned heavily into exploration and discovery. The wizards and witches of Greece were among the first to study the theoretical underpinnings of magic, blending it with early Mughal philosophy. The ancient wizard Daedalus, for example, is a figure steeped in legend, credited with crafting enchanted labyrinths and flying devices that inspired future magical transportation methods. The Greeks were also early pioneers in magical experimentation, developing potions and charms that became the forerunners of modern-day magical practices. However, not all ancient magical societies flourished so harmoniously. In the shadowy forests of northern Europe, magic was viewed with suspicion, even among magical practitioners themselves. Early magical communities in these regions lived in isolation, far from Mughal settlements. Here, the use of magic was primarily defensive, designed to repel threats, both human and creature alike. Legends from this time tell of wizards who bound themselves to enchanted woods, becoming protectors of the land, but losing their humanity in the process. The Druids, often remembered in Mughal history as enigmatic figures, were in fact a highly organized magical order, specializing in wandless magic and powerful nature-based enchantments. Their influence extended beyond magic. They were among the first to establish the idea of sacred magical spaces, a concept that would later inspire the protective enchantments around Hogwarts and other wizarding schools. What united all of these ancient societies, whether they thrived in the warmth of the Mediterranean sun or the icy reaches of the north, was their shared respect for the raw, untamed power of magic. It was not seen as something to be bent entirely to one's will, but rather as a force to be understood, revered, and used responsibly. Ancient wizards and witches understood that magic had its own rhythms, its own rules, and its own mysteries. To misuse it was to court disaster, a lesson that would echo through the ages. But as these magical societies grew in power, so too did the rift between magical and non-magical people. Misunderstandings, fear, and envy began to breed conflict. Mughal rulers, wary of the influence of wizards, began to turn against their magical neighbors. Ancient witch hunts, though far less organized than those of the Middle Ages, began to appear in pockets of the world. And while some magical communities chose to retreat into secrecy, others chose to fight. These conflicts, though tragic, shaped the course of wizarding history, laying the groundwork for the separation of the magical and non-magical worlds. In our next segment, we'll dive deeper into these early conflicts and explore how ancient wizards and witches began to navigate their increasingly precarious place in the world. How did their struggles give rise to the traditions and institutions we recognize today? And what lessons can we learn from their triumphs? As the ancient world progressed, the relationship between magical and non-magical people became increasingly strained. What began as a relatively harmonious coexistence started to fracture, giving rise to tensions that would eventually lead to the separation of the two worlds. This divide was not the result of a single event, but rather a culmination of many small cracks, misunderstandings, acts of fear and aggression, and even internal disagreements among magical communities themselves. To truly appreciate how the wizarding world came to hide in the shadows, we must delve into these formative struggles and how they forever altered the trajectory of magical history. One of the earliest known flashpoints occurred in the Middle East, where magical communities had long thrived alongside non-magical ones. For centuries, wizards and witches served as advisors to Mughal rulers, their magic aiding in everything from agriculture to the construction of grand cities. However, this relationship became increasingly fraught as Mughal leaders grew suspicious of the power wizards wielded. Historical accounts from magical scholars suggest that several rulers began to fear that magic might undermine their authority. This paranoia led to the first recorded magical purges, where witches and wizards were accused of treachery or of wielding curses against their rulers and were subsequently executed. These early conflicts highlighted a painful truth. Magic's power, while wondrous, often made it a target. The very abilities that allowed wizards and witches to heal the sick or shape the natural world also inspired fear and resentment. It wasn't long before this fear spread across other regions, particularly in Europe, where magical communities were far more isolated. In these northern regions, magic had always been shrouded in mystery, with many magical practitioners living in solitude to protect themselves from prying eyes. Stories of curses, dark forests, and otherworldly creatures became popular folklore, further fueling mistrust of anything associated with magic. But what of the magical communities themselves? It would be easy to assume that wizards and witches united against these rising threats, but history reveals a far more complicated reality. In many cases, magical communities were divided on how to respond to the growing hostility of Muggles. Some believed in maintaining an open relationship, insisting that magic could benefit everyone if only non-magical people could overcome their fears. Others argued that magic should be hidden entirely, that secrecy was the only way to ensure their survival. These debates often led to bitter disagreements, fracturing the once cohesive magical societies into smaller, scattered groups. A poignant example of this division can be found in the early Celtic magical traditions of Britain. The Druids, whose deep connection to the land made them revered by both magical and non-magical people, faced immense pressure as Muggle leaders began to rise in power. Some Druids chose to integrate into Muggle society, continuing their practices in secret. These enclaves became the precursors to modern wizarding villages like Godric's Hollow and Hogsmeade, safe havens where magic could flourish without fear of discovery. It was during this time of turmoil that the seeds of magical governance were sown. The need for organization and protection gave rise to early councils of wizards, small groups tasked with creating rules and providing guidance to their communities. These councils laid the groundwork for institutions like the Wizengamot, which would later become the cornerstone of magical law. Interestingly, records suggest that these councils were also among the first to experiment with memory charms, spells designed to erase specific memories from Muggles who had witnessed magic. Though primitive compared to the obliviation techniques perfected centuries later, these early memory charms were a significant step toward the eventual establishment of the International Statute of Secrecy. The use of memory charms marked a turning point in the history of the wizarding world. It represented the first deliberate attempt to separate magic from Muggle life. No longer was magic something to be shared openly, it became a closely guarded secret. This shift was not without controversy. Many wizards and witches saw it as a betrayal of their heritage, arguing that magic was meant to be celebrated, not hidden. Others, however, viewed it as a necessary evil, a way to protect their families and preserve their way of life in an increasingly hostile world. Amidst these tensions, magical education also began to evolve. In ancient times, magical knowledge was passed down orally or through apprenticeships. However, as magical communities became more isolated, there was a growing need for formalized instruction. Schools of magic began to emerge, often hidden in remote locations, to avoid detection by muggles. These institutions, while rudimentary by today's standards, provided a safe space for young witches and wizards to learn and refine their abilities. Some of the earliest known magical schools, such as Mahoutokoro Koro in Japan and Uegado in Africa, trace their origins back to this period. Of course, not all magical communities embraced isolation. In parts of Asia and Africa, where cultural attitudes toward magic were often more accepting, wizards and witches continued to play prominent roles in society. In ancient China, for example, magical scholars were deeply respected, their knowledge often sought after by Mughal emperors. Similarly, in Africa, the magical arts were seen as a natural extension of the world's mysteries, and magical practitioners often worked openly alongside their non-magical counterparts. These regions offer a glimpse of what the wizarding world might have been like had the divide between magic and Muggle life not grown so severe. But for most magical communities, secrecy became the rule rather than the exception. By the end of the ancient world, the foundations of the magical world as we know it today had been laid. The divide between magical and non-magical people was not yet absolute, but the paths of their histories were diverging. The fear and mistrust that had driven wizards and witches into hiding would only grow in the centuries to come, culminating in the creation of the International Statute of Secrecy in 1689. In the next segment, we'll explore how these ancient struggles influenced magical traditions and institutions in the medieval period. From the rise of wand-making to the founding of Hogwarts itself, how did these early efforts at secrecy shape the wizarding world we recognize today? And what lessons can we draw from the resilience of those ancient wizards and witches who dared to protect their magic in the face of adversity? As the ancient world gave way to the medieval era, the struggles of early magical communities left an indelible mark on the development of wizarding traditions, practices, and institutions. While the divide between magical and non-magical people was not yet complete, it had grown deep enough to alter the course of history. Wizards and witches increasingly turned inward, creating a self-contained world that sought to preserve magical knowledge while minimizing contact with Muggles. This period saw the rise of many hallmarks of wizarding culture, including the art of wand-making, the emergence of magical schools, and the establishment of customs that still persist today. One of the most significant developments during this time was the refinement of wand-making, which revolutionized how witches and wizards practiced magic. In the ancient world, magical practitioners relied on rudimentary methods to channel their power, such as their own hands, enchanted objects, or even spoken word alone. It was during the early medieval period that wands became the dominant tool for focusing and amplifying magical energy. The earliest wands were simple constructs, often fashioned by individual witches and wizards who experimented with various materials. However, as demand for reliable magical tools grew, wand-making evolved into a highly specialized craft. The Ollivander family, whose name is synonymous with wand-making today, is believed to have begun perfecting their techniques around this time. Early wand-makers discovered that pairing certain woods with specific magical cores, such as phoenix feathers, dragon heartstrings, or unicorn hair, created wands with unique properties, allowing for more precise and consistent spell casting. Wand lore as a field of study grew out of this innovation, further cementing the role of wands in everyday magical life. The development of wands also had a profound impact on magical education. In the ancient world, magical knowledge was often passed down through families or small communities, and mastery of magic was a slow, organic process. With the advent of wands, however, magic became more accessible and versatile. This shift led to the founding of formal magical institutions, where young witches and wizards could learn the intricacies of spellwork, potion making, and other magical disciplines. One of the most notable institutions to emerge during this period was Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Founded by the legendary four founders, Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. Hogwarts was more than just a school. It was a sanctuary, a safe haven where magical children could grow and thrive, away from the prying eyes of Muggles. The enchanted castle, hidden deep in the Scottish Highlands, was protected by powerful spells that rendered it invisible to non-magical people. This blend of education and secrecy made Hogwarts a symbol of the wizarding world's resilience and ingenuity. The creation of Hogwarts and other magical schools like it reflected a growing desire among magical communities to preserve their heritage and protect their young. Education became a means of ensuring that magical knowledge was not lost in the face of increasing persecution. The curriculum at these schools often included practical skills for survival, such as the use of concealment charms and defensive spells, as well as more traditional subjects like transfiguration and herbology, and to preserve safe purity for more traditional ways. Over time, these institutions became the cultural heart of the wizarding world, shaping generations of witches and wizards. This era also saw the rise of magical traditions and customs that would become cornerstones of wizarding society. Many of these traditions were born out of necessity, as wizards and witches adapted to the challenges of living in a world where they were no longer welcome. For example, the use of flue powder and portkeys, methods of magical transportation that allowed for quick and discreet travel, became increasingly popular as magical communities grew more insular. Similarly, the creation of enchanted objects like invisibility cloaks and sneakerscopes reflected the need for secrecy and self-preservation. Magical communities also began to develop unique cultural practices that set them apart from their non-magical counterparts. Wizarding holidays, such as Samhain, an ancient precursor to modern-day Halloween, were celebrated with a blend of reverence and revelry, often involving elaborate magical displays. These traditions served as a way to unite magical communities and preserve their identity in the face of growing isolation. But while the medieval period was a time of innovation and adaptation for the wizarding world, it was also a time of conflict and fear. The persecution of witches and wizards intensified as Muggle societies became more organized and religious fervor swept across Europe. Witch hunts, fueled by fear and superstition, became increasingly common, although many of the accusations were baseless, targeting Muggles rather than actual magical practitioners. The hunts created an atmosphere of paranoia that further widened the gap between the magical and non-magical worlds. In response to these threats, wizards and witches developed new ways to protect themselves. The Fidelis Charm, a spell capable of hiding a location so completely that only a chosen secret keeper could reveal it, is believed to have been invented during this time. Similarly, magical communities began using unplottable charms to conceal entire villages and towns, ensuring that they could not be found on any Muggle map. These defensive measures laid the groundwork for the International Statute of Secrecy, which would later formalize the separation of the two worlds. The medieval period was a turning point for the wizarding world, a time of both great innovation and profound loss. The legacy of this era can still be felt in the customs, institutions, and practices of modern magical society. The resilience of wizards and witches in the face of adversity ensured that magic would not only survive, but thrive, even as the world around them grew more hostile. In our final segment, we'll explore the long-term consequences of this period of transformation. How did the wizarding world evolve into the hidden society we see today? And what lessons can be drawn from the triumphs and tragedies of ancient and medieval magical history? The medieval period solidified many of the traditions and structures that still define the wizarding world today, but it also marked the beginning of a more decisive move towards secrecy. As the centuries progressed, magical communities retreated further into the shadows, seeking refuge from the growing dangers of Muggle persecution. This transition was not just a reaction to external threats. It was a deliberate and transformative choice that forever shaped the relationship between the magical and non-magical worlds. To understand how the wizarding world became the hidden society we know today, we must examine the long-lasting effects of the decisions made during these crucial years. The International Statute of Secrecy, enacted in 1689, is often seen as the defining moment in the separation of magical and non-magical worlds. However, its roots stretch back centuries to the whispered debates in medieval magical councils and the protective spells cast over hidden communities. The statute itself was born out of necessity, following a sharp increase in witch hunts across Europe and beyond. By the 17th century, Muggles had developed more organized and efficient ways of detecting and persecuting witches and wizards, often fueled by religious fervor and political manipulation. Magical communities realized that survival required more than individual acts of concealment. It demanded a unified, global effort. The Statute of Secrecy established a new era of magical governance. Magical ministries and governing bodies were created in nearly every region of the world, each tasked with enforcing secrecy and ensuring the safety of their citizens. In Britain, the Ministry of Magic rose to prominence, taking over the responsibilities once held by smaller, localized councils. Departments like the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes and the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures were formed to manage interactions with Muggles and prevent accidental exposure. The creation of these institutions marked a turning point. The wizarding world was no longer simply adapting to survive, it was actively building a self-contained society. Yet, this newfound secrecy came at a cost. The separation of magical and non-magical worlds meant that wizards and witches had to abandon their roles as healers, leaders, and innovators within Muggle society. Ancient traditions that had once flourished in the open, such as the healing arts practiced by magical druids or the enchanted craftsmanship of early wand makers, were now, over time, this isolation created a cultural divide between magical and non-magical people, erasing centuries of shared history and fostering misconceptions on both sides. The wizarding world's withdrawal also had profound implications for magical education and knowledge. Schools like Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang, which had once been regional centers of learning, became vital institutions tasked with preserving magical heritage. The Hogwarts motto, Draco dormient nunquam titilandus, never tickle a sleeping dragon, took on a new layer of meaning during this time. It was a reminder not only of the dangers of magic, but also of the need for caution in a world that had grown hostile to it. The curriculum at magical schools began to emphasize concealment and self-defense, preparing students for a life lived in secrecy. Despite these challenges, the isolation of the wizarding world also allowed magic to flourish in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. Freed from the scrutiny and interference of non-magical authorities, magical communities developed unique traditions, advanced their magical arts, and deepened their connection to magical creatures and the natural world. This era saw the creation of extraordinary magical inventions, from the development of the Floo network to the invention of magical quills and self-correcting ink. These innovations not only made life easier for wizards and witches, but also reinforced their sense of identity and independence. Magical creatures, too, found their place in this hidden world. The Statute of Secrecy necessitated new regulations to protect magical beasts from Muggle discovery, leading to the creation of the magical world's first comprehensive laws on magical creatures. Wizards and witches worked to safeguard habitats for creatures like dragons, hippogriffs, and unicorns, ensuring that these extraordinary beings could thrive away from human interference. From my perch on the throne, organizations such as the Dragon Research and Restraint Bureau were established to manage these efforts, laying the groundwork for the modern-day Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. However, the wizarding world's secrecy was never absolute. Magical and non-magical lives continue to intersect in small, subtle ways. Squibs, individuals born into magical families but lacking magical abilities, often lived on the margins of both worlds, serving as quiet bridges between the two. Likewise, Muggle-born witches and wizards, who grew up in the non-magical world before discovering their magical abilities, brought fresh perspectives and ideas into magical society. These connections, though tenuous, were a reminder that the divide between magical and non-magical worlds was never entirely complete. Even today, the legacy of ancient and medieval wizarding history can be seen in every aspect of magical life. The Hogwarts houses, for example, reflect the values and priorities of their founders, who lived during the early years of magical secrecy. Gryffindor's bravery, Hufflepuff's loyalty, Ravenclaw's intellect, and Slytherin's ambition are all similarly the continued use of magical runes, potions, and charms speaks to the enduring influence of ancient magical practices. As we conclude our exploration of the wizarding world's ancient history, it is clear that the choices made by early magical communities continue to shape the lives of witches and wizards today. The resilience, creativity, and determination of those ancient wizards and witches ensured that magic could survive in a world that often sought to suppress. Their struggles remind us that the story of the wizarding world is not just one of concealment, but also one of perseverance, adaptation, and hope. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is the reminder that magic is not simply a tool or a talent. It is a way of understanding the world, a connection to something greater than oneself. Whether it is practiced openly or in secret, magic remains a source of wonder, a testament to the strength of those who carry its legacy. As Harry Potter himself once said, working hard is important, but there's something that matters even more. And that belief, passed down through the centuries, is the true magic that binds the wizarding world together.